Welcome back. I have one brief program announcement before we continue with the next panel, and that is, regrettably, Ursula Frohn could not make it. So what we've done is asked Geert Lovnik to appear in the last panel. So we're going to have two panels this afternoon, each with two speakers, and there will be plenty of time for discussion in between, as well as a brief break. I'm Lisa Gitelman from the Catholic University of America in DC, and it's been my great pleasure to be one of the fellows here at the Leslie Center. And I'm just going to do the briefest of introductions for our two speakers in this first afternoon panel. For people in some fields, and for people in my field, whatever name it has, Michael Heim and Alan Liu don't really need a lot of introduction. I'm going to be brief and speak in case you are not in this field, whatever it is. To introduce them both for a panel entitled Challenges to the Academy in the Digital Age. And the idea that there would be challenges, I suppose, warms the cockles of my tiny heart. But Michael Heim and Alan Liu can be, I think, connected, if you like, as really important and exciting early adopters. Michael Heim published his first book, Electric Language, on it was a philosophical study of word processing in 1987. So just think for a second. I mean, I like to, imagine myself pulling out that 5 3/4-inch floppy disk and putting it in to boot up the computer. And I had such a kind of intuitive clarity when I dealt with the daisy wheel printer, but not so much with the word processor. So I was learning how to do it in 87, and Michael was figuring out what it meant. He has since published a number of other titles, among them Virtual Realism, about worlds and about the ability of avatar or virtual worlds to transform us. And he, I think, continues to work on transformations. We've been talking at this conference a little bit about classification, categorization, and profiling. So just to conclude my brief words about Michael, I'd like to just read you the opening links of his webpage, and you'll get a kind of idea that we're going to hear from somebody who has a unique take and a kind of powerful way of conceptualizing the digital environment. Some things are not so strange. You can click on Michael's home, his contact link, his books, his articles, his seminars, his conferences. But then there are two links that are unusual. One is the link for worlds, and one is the link for Tai Chi. So I'm going to let Michael, kind of pick up and make sense of who he is and what that means. His title for today is Adventures of the CyberForum, a Cautionary Tale about Cyber-Disciplinarity. And then our second speaker, who is in sunny California, will be appearing remotely, is Professor Alan Liu. Alan is also a very influential and very exciting early adopter, in his case of the World Wide Web. Alan began his web page, portal, organization, resource site, The Voice of the Shuttle, in 1994, and it went public early in 1995. If you haven't used it, it's kind of difficult to describe, but when you do look at the Voice of the Shuttle site, I urge you to also look at this site, www.dejavu.org. It's a nostalgia site with some emulations of old browsers, and you can look through a Mosaic browser at the Voice of the Shuttle site and see what it was when Alan started doing it. It's pretty amazing that he was there on that World Wide Web when it was so naive, I suppose. And Alan kind of self-consciously announces the Voice of a Shuttle site as for and about the humanities, and in particular cyber-disciplinarity, to think through how the traditional humanities are changing in response to other fields outside the humanities and digital media. So he, again, arrived at the question of cyber-disciplinarity, I think, before it occurred to me, certainly, many, many years before it occurred to me, and perhaps to many of you. Recently, Alan is the author of The Laws of Cool, Knowledge Work and the Culture of Information, as well as an article that I just love and has been very important to me, Transcendental Data Toward a Cultural History and Aesthetics of the New Encoded Discourse, about encoded text. He's now at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and is embarking on a new project called the Transliteracies Project, Research in the Technological, Social, and cultural practices of online reading. And Alan will speak today about the humanities, a technical profession. We're going to ask both of our speakers to speak in order, and then we'll take questions at the end. There will be about a 1-minute technological adjustment gap between the two talks, but I hope you can be patient while we do that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Mark, for the invitation. I'm so glad that originally that my thought was in this panel, although we've changed the time schedule a bit, but I'm so glad that Alan Liu is going to be in this panel, and originally Hert Lovink was going to be also. Both of these works, I think, are going to be good correctives to the kind of description that I'm going to give of my experience. I think that in some ways you need Alan Liu to show what positive possibilities, ways in which the challenge of digital media can be dealt with by an academic department that seeks to move beyond its traditional definition. When I was there at Santa Barbara and had the pleasure of becoming friends with Alan and his colleague William Warner, I was so struck by the way that they were helping their graduate students to become familiar with and to rub elbows with the software industry. So they were taking their English graduate students and English majors into the field and showing them, interviewing with people in the software industry and showing them what was possible with their education. And so I think this is an incredible contribution to the effort of cyber-disciplinarity, this topic. And Hert Lovink has written an incredible book called Dark Fiber, which is dark. And it's what I love about it. I think it's a corrective of optimism. And I think so both of those are wonderful correctives to my attitudes, which have their limits in my experience and limited to my life as I've lived it. Because actually what I'm trying to do is to wake up. I'm trying to wake up from a dream. I'm trying to stretch and breathe and move so that I can feel connected to the real. So I can break from a dream that I think in some ways is haunting me. In fact, this presentation is a form of its haunting me. And so I'm glad to tell you about my dream. You know, it's useful for me to talk about it in that way, in this way, I think. Maybe it's part of my waking up and talking it through. So my title is about the adventures of the CyberForum. And the CyberForum, as I'll explain, is a project, a long-range project intended originally for maybe 3 years or so to use avatars, a game-like computer simulation of human forms, which are used in games and used in video games and so on, but to create avatar interactions that would reach around the globe to connect children in different parts of the world. I'll explain a little more in details about it, but it's really, what I really am talking about indirectly, maybe at the first more directly, is a cyber-disciplinarity, which I think is a kind of a beast, an untamed being that, however, has great mythic power and terrific attraction. And I think of it as a unicorn. A unicorn has a horse's body, the legs of a stag, lion's tail, and in some of the old paintings you'll see it lancing things with its dragons, for example, a little lance with its horn. It's an incredibly rich transfiguration of what's real. It's a dream-like being. It's a fantasy being. And it's just what interdisciplinarity is. Also a unicorn. Multidisciplinarity. Take all of those terms. I found a number of them. Trans-disciplinary. These are mythical beings that are quite attractive and powerful. But they're neither fish, flesh, nor fowl. And, in fact, they don't exist. I hate to tell you this. It's a dream to think that they exist. I mean, they must exist in some sense, but they really don't exist, not in reality. They are unicorns, these notions of interdisciplinarity. So the dream, in some sense, is that cyber-disciplinarity could be, for example, that a culture that produces technology. Yesterday, the comment came through so nicely from Michael Curry, how Anglo-American philosophers don't consider technology. And isn't it interesting that largely academics were probably the last stronghold of anti-technology, humanities, for example, as a place where technology was resisted, certainly as a theme, as a thematic. Wouldn't it be something if there was such a thing as a humanistic drive to get a grip on the technology that we are producing in the Western world? To get a grip on it, meaning to look at it critically. Not only that, to be constructive and look at it critically in a constructive way, that we can suggest and show possibilities. And we can lead the human species in terms of what humans can do and be in the new environments that we're creating in digital media. For that to happen, the departmental walls would have to fall before this mythical beast. Because what happens, in fact, I suggest, in reality, is that digital culture meets, in the sense of runs up against, academic disciplines. We have a culture that's innovating constantly, 24/7 culture. And yet the academic itself is retrospective, based on continuity, based on building on the past and transmitting that treasures from the past into the future. Very sensible thing to do. However, there's a terrific wall between them, or tension between them. So there's a structure, an academic structure, that the digital culture runs into. And I'm sure most of you have stories about this kind of run-in to those walls. There's also this global connectivity, this incredible infrastructure, this global infrastructure that we have with the internet now, which means we really, in some sense, cannot even recognize the national differences. I mean, in some sense, we should be leading a humanity that doesn't recognize the kind of structures that we see in national politics, as well as, of course, departmental turf. So we have this drive to instant access, and we have an academic system that works very conservatively, basing itself on peer review, very carefully moving along, having a structure that guarantees continuity, which is very desirable. But what about a culture that's constantly breaking, making breakthroughs, innovating? Maybe, what about that? What about those two? So academic departments are based on authority through historical preservation. It's obvious, right? I mean, if you think about it for a moment. But what does this mean in practice? In practice, when digital culture meets it? What limits does it place on what we as people interested and working in digital culture can do in terms of not only criticism, but also constructive action, constructive criticism? What about leading? What about academic vision that leads the industries that we're producing and generating throughout the globe? So the academic departments have this legitimate concern of transmitting what we've learned in the past. I'm just reiterating in different ways is this thing that's really quite obvious, but you know what? It has taken me so much experience and so long to come to say these things, because I think in some sense I didn't want to believe they were true, that it seemed to me, well, maybe I'll get to another point, what I was thinking when I approached cyber-disciplinarity. But notice, for example, the the transition that was made successfully by one area, computer science, which in the 1970s was called data processing, and 1980s became computer science at the resistance, under the resistance of mathematicians who certainly don't consider science to be involved, their mathematical science to be involved, nor of course physics or natural sciences to be involved. So that was a great struggle. What made the struggle successful, however, on the part of digital culture, seems to be the clear career paths that were available, that whole economy of career paths that opened up the computer science as a academic discipline. So if you look at the history of the virtual reality studies, the interesting thing and maybe the exciting thing about it has always been that there is a zoo of people. And to me, this was always interesting. As someone trained in philosophy, this was very interesting, that we would have people from different disciplines who were required to work in virtual reality to make sense of it, to make it work. So now I'm going to explain a little bit in terms of my own experience. I guess this motto of Socrates seemed to me to be a good one, but I'm not sure if it's a very safe one or a very recommendable one, commendable one. But Socrates says in the Republic, we must follow the argument, the logos, wherever, like a wind, it may lead us, like the wind, wherever it moves. So from 1998 to 2002, I began a series of experiments. As I say, it was a rather long-range concept to experiment with and develop avatar worlds, which are like the 3D gaming worlds, but not as governed by the productive cycles of companies that have to sell their games, but rather an open experiment that would gradually gain definition over a period of time as to what it was trying to do. So it started out at Art Center College of Design, and it produced these kind of avatar events, which you see up on screen. These being, of course, projections of human physical bodies, insofar as people would control, just as you would with a joystick, you would control these physical bodies. And we used, the software we used was Adobe Atmosphere was the second generation we used. The first one, which you see on screen, is Active Worlds, which was an early version of 3D virtual environments. So we then used Adobe. I think Adobe now actually will allow you to put a 3D world embedded into an Acrobat page. So you can actually use their 3D browser, which is called Adobe Atmosphere, and you can embed a world in a PDF file. This is the latest version, I believe, of Acrobat. So this, for example, is an event where what's happening here is people are doing their dances and meeting each other, and you can see that their chat is above their head. So there's a kind of an issue of typing and talking at the same time. Some of the interface is a bit primitive, but this whole environment is a creation of students who were able to modify the avatars to create a certain shape, as well as to create objects to create the environment. And for example, this world has no gravity except by implication of a physical form that maybe they may prefer to have feet, but these actually are floating in space. And this space is a wire mesh that expands as the avatars move through it. And it gives the illusion of being able to escape, but it continually regenerates itself. So the goal in this form, for example, was simply to learn to play in these non-physical spaces, to navigate in these non-physical spaces, and to see what kind of possibilities could be generated. What we came up with in the CyberForum, some alternatives to video games. What we ended up doing was we held real-time events, and these were limited to 1-hour events, so they would have an intensity about them, so they wouldn't be just worlds floating around all the time with no one in them. So we had specific events, and we designed the environments and the avatars for the specific event. So it was like a theme park, but it could be put together in maybe 2 or 3 hours by the designers. And these were coordinated across time zones. They were international events. There were people around the world in a lot of countries, in a lot of hemispheres who participated in them. And they were hosted by a welcoming team, and this is very important for the success of these events. We had a team of maybe a dozen students, graduate and undergraduate students at Art Center, who learned, first of all, how to navigate these worlds themselves, how to handle the characters, and then how to help other people catch on quickly. This was the difficulty, is to bring people up to speed as soon as they get online and say, what am I doing in this space? And I can't walk. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to navigate this space? And so how to deal with this complete shocking experience at first required a welcoming team. So I found that to be really an important thing to make those events succeed. And we also customize these open events. As I say, each topic, for example, if we would have a topic of cyber-disciplinarity, I'm not saying we would do this, but we would create maybe an environment where we'd have different cubicles or walls, and we would say these are departments. We would, in other words, we would thematize the topic, and we would have some game or some way of talking. Here's the cyber discipline, and how does it relate to these other walls and cubicles? So in other words, we tried to use like a memory palace image, except we reversed it. So instead of trying to use the memory palace to give a talk and to remember what your talk's topics are, we were trying to project the talk into a virtual palace so that you would never forget that topic in that event. And this actually was successful in some cases, and I'll show you some samples of how it worked. Well, this is just a list. There's a web page with the archives of the CyberForum. I think this was in the year 2000, 2001. 2000, I see. For example, we had Kate Hales was there in February 26th, so on. So we gave talks with various cyber theorists who would come in, who were brave enough to take us up, and we would read their papers and their books, and we would create a theme environment for them, and invite them to come in, and some of them were brave enough to do it. And we have log files of our interactions with them, sometimes playful, sometimes not. I remember Kate Hales, for example, who is extraordinary, as you know, a mind and an articulate individual. It was like reading one of her papers. Her avatar spoke like a paper. It was fantastic. I mean, she would respond to a small question with quite a lengthy discourse that was very coherent and quite astonishing. On the other hand, Bill Mitchell from MIT, the architect theorist, he was like, wow, wow. So he was expressing himself in very different terms and very, very short, very brief terms. So the notion, too, was hidden in this all is, of course, that an author is no longer protected in this culture. As an author used to be someone who gave you the book and disappeared and let you have it there, but you don't get away with that anymore. It's a little bit harder. And so people are going to bring you into a participatory conversation, whether it's talk radio. But we were actually bearing down quite hard on them, having them become an avatar in their own thematized world that their thoughts had created. So these were pretty complex experiments and gave us the first stage. Because the first stage was to try to learn how to use these environments the avatar environments, and how to, but notice, which disciplines were involved in this case? I mean, which course? What we did at Art Center was, well, these are images from some of our creations. So a group of artists are going to create different kind of designed environments and use different kind of fantasy than you might find in a less abstract kind of convention world, let's say. There are some worlds that are very much imitations of the physical world, which the artists were not interested in doing, replicating the physical world. Why do that? We already have the physical world. So they were trying to create a more abstract world. Some people described it as Kandinsky-like when they saw it. But we changed the world frequently when inspiration or theme called for it. This is a theme on light, where we were passing through these very powerful areas, spectacular sort of areas. And of course here our avatars are huge birds that are just flying through the space. And a very exhilarating experience, actually, to understand this, you actually have to, it's like a Nintendo. I mean, you actually have to do it yourself. to get that thrill and that feeling of it. There is something, if you play Nintendo, for example, you can actually work up a sweat. You can actually feel that you've been on that ski slope with that Nintendo. And likewise, you can feel in this particular world that you're this huge bird going through these very cool, vast, radiant spaces. So it can be very exciting, and people share that experience and remember it. This shows you how sometimes a discourse can become hard to read as the people are chatting and flying through space. This was a maze, a labyrinth that was constructed for another event. And here you can see a little bit more of the distribution of avatars as I'm trying to recognize some of the people here. So people wrote up, you can find various, on the CyberForum reference I gave you, you can find people who were there from different cultures, journalists and people from Chronicles of Higher Education and so on, have written up descriptions of these events, have experienced them and tried to put into print something of what they felt in them, which is very difficult to do. So this was Bill Mitchell's event, I think, as I recall. And here's a sign of here's the Active Worlds browser about 4 years ago. You can see these are all the worlds. When we started, there were maybe 200 to 300 worlds, and we finished, there were over 1,000 in a period of 2 years or so. It just mushroomed and grew increasingly. This is one of our most successful spaces because it was one where whenever a speaker was reluctant didn't feel comfortable in the environment because you know what happens is when you're in these virtual worlds, you can see what everybody's thinking. It's like right now, if I could see behind me here all of your thoughts as you were thinking them while I'm talking, that can make you nervous. You know, and also it can become, you know, hard to deal with from everybody. And this is what happens in a virtual lecture. When we invited these people to come in, they were pretty brave because we explained to them that it was going to be an open chat environment. So you can hear what everybody's thinking while you're lecturing. It has some advantages. I mean, then you know what people are thinking. But it has disadvantages too. But this was a space where people would calm down. Because what happens is you can see from outside through it, and there appear to be no walls. But when you're inside, it's completely closed. It closes into a very comfortable, cozy kind of dome. So on the outside, it looks very different, and people are attracted to it. And then when they go inside, it makes them feel very comfortable. So these were some design issues that came up. Here's people inside the dome. It's kind of hard to get a feeling of its space without actually becoming an avatar. And this was a avatar dance where the avatar parts would exchange as you danced. So an arm would fly over to the other avatar, and it was quite an experience described. So these do play tricks with your sense of your body and yourself, and can do different things. This was the plankton float where we took a paper from the group called Principia Cybernetica, a group in Brussels and some of it in Santa Fe, New Mexico, here in the defense group there. They had written a paper among their theories that described the internet as being like this huge juggernaut which was going to swallow, like a leviathan, they said, all the plankton who were not going to take up the internet. It was just going to swallow them like plankton. So when we had them come and speak, they all became plankton and floated in this huge dark belly of the beast. And so after they finished, they swore they would never use that phrase again. So it was a memorable experience for them to see how students reacted and put them into it. In various forms of memory, using photography, we used TV. We could get CNN on a wall as well and things like that. But most interesting to us was what these avatars could do, what these worlds could do that was unique. And of course, one of the things was that they could be remote. We could have, just as Alan is remote and yet with us, and will be more, I guess he'll be more with us in a little while. But he's with us in some sense right now, following and being a part of our group. But there's also another way that these groups can be used is something called the avatar alcove. And at UCLA, we had an experiment, which I'll show you some photos from people at Art Center and the Southern California Institute of Architecture, SCI-Arc. We used a 26-foot immersion screen. I'm just going to go quickly because my time is running out, but this is a sort of thing where we had this huge screen. We projected, you can recognize the same type of avatar environment, but we could interact physically and dance with those avatars. Some of them were in Sweden, different parts of Europe, and South America. You can get an idea here of the complexity of the layering, where we could dance and move around with that characters on the screen. That's why we made these avatars black, like this, so simple and stark, as opposed to animal avatars or other forms. And here you can see what people remotely saw. They could see photos of the avatars as well as a QuickTime window, which showed the actual physical room. So people remotely could see the physical bodies as well as the avatar bodies. They could move their avatar bodies and interact with these physical bodies and see the feedback of that interaction. So people were able to actually dance and move with each other as avatars remotely. So you have basically an avatar dance. This is another version of that same kind of thing where you know, I'm touching the avatar, and it's actually the person remotely sees this and also sees this window, and they can move their avatar to interact with me. Kind of hard to describe, but. And then we moved it into the Hotel Pro Forma, which was a project we submitted to a competition. As architect and I, Christoph Kornebär, works in Los Angeles as an architect at the Push firm, which he founded. And we did it for the Orested suburb in Copenhagen, and it was exhibited in Denmark. And it was a finalist, but it wasn't actually built. The hotel project ran out of funds and wasn't built. But the project, we had avatar alcoves projected on the walls of this hotel. And the concept was to bring these presences of people who had stayed at the hotel at one time and allow them to return in some form, in this avatar form, to be like a ghost in a sense, but actually to be able to interact with people who were now in the hotel. By the way, the hotel is a performance artist hotel. It was a mixture, a very strange mixture of a hotel with a performance art troupe called the Hotel Pro Forma, who perform in Sweden. This was an outer view of it. But we were trying to distribute avatars through as projections in many of the areas in the hotel. And it would be quite a job for the keepers of the hotel to keep it alive. But it seemed to us that if we were going to project an architecture for the next century, it would have to be one that had a live digital culture. That if we're truly the next step in architecture, it wouldn't be just something that was built on a computer and then put into the physical world, but it would also be one in which the computer life, the human projection into computers, would come alive inside the building. So you'd have an alcove in a building where you would have avatars who were either people in the hotel, people who had been in the hotel, people interested in the hotel, people who wanted to buy items related to the hotel, or some such. So it was an example of something trying to think through the interactivity on the architectural level in a very thorough way, so we would navigate with Palm Pilots. So anyway, how we did some of the avatars, I'm gonna move along pretty rapidly. We used some of the tools called Poser, Avatar Lab, and so on. And the next step was to take this tool, which is like something like this, and to develop kits. Our next step was to make it into kits that would be something we could show to other colleges. And the goal would be to have other college teams meet with us over a period of another year of experiment and learning how to best use these with kids. And the group that I had in mind, there's a PC Clubhouse sponsored by Intel. There's actually 300 of them in the world, distributed throughout the world for minority kids, or there's another term is used, like deprived kids, or kids who don't have access to much technology. And there is one in LA, and and there are actually other instances. It started with some talks that I had with an Israeli journalist, and the idea was, how can these virtual worlds help heal the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And the notion that we developed over a period of discussion was that we could have mentors college mentors who would show kids on our part of the world how to play with kids in another part of the world. And they would show them how to meet and create their own avatars and create their own environments. Very simple avatars, simple environments. But the kit would be something that could be distributed and could be useful. It would be making it easier for people to use it, college kids to show younger kids. So the notion was that when you have conflicts in the globe, the way to heal the conflict is to have the children in those cultures play with each other in an environment in which they can meet the other. In some sense, perhaps the avatars could express the otherness. That we at the point we had left it that open. So the notion was, developed this idea. These are some other experiments where we're using a combination of avatars and real time. This was at UCLA. And then September 11th, this was an avatar memorial event on that day. Or I think it was the 14th, yeah, that's right. Putting together the broken world. And so it seemed at that time that the alternatives, the cultural alternatives, to take these things that Americans had developed, these games, would be so crucial now. It would be like starting the pen pal movement and try to use this in the broken parts of the world. And the term I came up with for it at the time was avatar diplomacy, which was really the wrong term to use in 2001, 2002. This was a non-starter. People in America were not using the word diplomacy. It was a dirty word. I don't know if you remember it or remember what happened at that time. But the goal was to take something like America's Army, which is the Army recruitment avatar game, and to transform it into something more playful and more childlike, and to reach to that next generation who has not yet been taught how to hate, and to bring them a certain kind of playfulness that we have in the world of entertainment games. So this was an education initiative that would require quite a bit of heart and force and direction over a period of time, maybe based on academia, but maybe not. And so this was sort of the grand title of the project. And so it was an effort to try to create this kind of friendships, like pen pal. I had pen pals when I was a kid, and I think today to have pen pals is not quite our culture. And we need something more like avatar buddies or something like that would work with young people. So there are some groups in Canada that are doing the pen pal thing, using the web and using letters, which is an older model. But this was an idea to use something like the online games and to move it forward with other cultures. But I think one of the things that would be required is to do it very carefully over a period of time, to do the experiments and to learn from the experiments what works, what doesn't, what's too dangerous to do. For example, in Sweden, the people most interested in this so far, the people in Sweden have shown a lot of interest, although it's never happened. They've gotten very close to supporting this project, but it hasn't happened. But the people in Sweden invited Palestinian kids and Israeli kids to come to Stockholm so they could have a meeting and play together. So this is a similar idea. What happened was they got to the hotel and the Palestinian group received a message that if they participate any further in this, that they would be endangering their lives. So that's the kind of situation that these projects run into. I mean, it's so it does, for me, the idea of a cyber discipline, one in this sense, and this is maybe too idealistic and it's trans-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, all those bad things that are not really functional, that don't have power, to see how things, so this has been a dream. And there's been various close calls where this dream got closer to maybe happening, but it hasn't happened. And I'm trying to wake up from it, frankly. It's a very dissonant dream to have, because it should exist, it must exist, but it does not exist, and probably will not exist. What I can recommend to you is look for the dissonant harmonies in life. The blues, an incredible creation by people who were having a miserable time, but who kept their spirits using dissonance to lift their spirit, to have a joyful noise. Tai Chi, it's all about conflict and how to soften in the process of undergoing conflict. So I just want to thank you for your attention. Maybe I'm waking up a little more.
Well, thanks for being with me, and I apologize that I can't be there in the meet, as William Gibson is wont to say. I teach a Monday, Wednesday, Friday lecture course, actually on the culture of information this quarter, and there's just literally no flight leaving for the Dartmouth area after my class on Friday that would have allowed me to get here at your conference on time. So I hope that this is not too discombobulating an event. It's a little bit odd for me. Let me begin with a supposition. Suppose that humanities computing, digital humanities, technology in the humanities, media arts and technology, new media studies, and other such awkwardly named associations and programs will one day fulfill their mission. That mission, phrased broadly, is to integrate information technology in the work of the humanities so fully and in so entangled a manner, at once as tool, perspective, and theme, that it would seem just as redundant to add the words computing, digital media, or technology to the word humanities as it was previously to add, for example, print-based. Information technology will simply be part of the business of the humanities along with all its other business. What then? Then I surmise it will make a great deal of difference whether the incorporation of information technology in the humanities, in its business, as I called it, occurred with or without critical awareness of the specifically professional meaning of such technology in relation to other professions in which IT has a defining role. That difference, a difference in critical technological awareness and self-critical awareness too, bears, I think, on the larger situation of the Academy today, and may be identified through a sequence of exploratory theses as follows. So what I want to do is give you 5 sort of theses, first 3 of which are descriptive, I think, and the last 2 of which are prescriptive. First thesis is this one. Humanities scholars are also knowledge workers today. Ours is the age of the rise of the symbolic analyst and of intellectual capital. Robert Reich and Thomas A. Stewart declare, respectively, in 2 of the many books of popularizing economic discourse that appeared in the 1990s, to dedicate our new millennium to the work of knowledge. The distinguishing feature of such knowledge work is that it is governed by an increasingly common set of institutional, disciplinary, communicational, technical, and other practical, as in the notion of best practices, protocols for managing productive thought. Whether it's tightly wrapped as an internet transmission protocol, or as fuzzy, yet nevertheless prescriptive as corporate culture, these protocols include all the host of standards, specifications, declarations, procedures, routines, and functions that now bind the workers of the so-called professional, technical, managerial new class to the post-industrial program of efficiency with flexibility. As the full title of Stewart's book just mentioned, Intellectual Capital, The New Wealth of Organizations, indicates, the dominant protocols of knowledge work are those of business today. Yet we should recognize that there are now no natural outer bounds to business. All the following social sectors, for example, have been touched by the logic and discourse of post-industrial corporatism: the military, the health industry, government, even non-governmental organizations. Thus consider the odd conjunction between the new logistics-driven US military with its just-in-time forces and communication networks and the anti-globalist NGOs with their own just-in-time protest forces mobilized through IT, as well as managing your NGO business instruments provided by such organizations as the Association for Progressive Communications. And I think you can see now on the second screen the web page that I'm showing. Is that okay? It's a webpage from the Association for Progressive Communications titled Managing Your NGO, and it's replete with tools and case studies, business planning for NGOs, financial management tools, how to estimate a budget's project, business administration, what to include in a business contract, how to develop a marketing plan, and so on. To this list of institutions influenced by post-industrial business, we can add, I think, our academy, including especially my topic for today, the humanities in higher education. I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination, after all, to see that scholars increasingly perform analytical, managerial, administrative, and other kinds of professional work that seem ripe for corporate-inspired, just-in-time, and total quality reforms. This is a site that I started some years ago titled Polynuris, the Academy and the Corporation. The title is one of those mythological plays like Michael engaged in his talk, Polynuris. My implication is like the Academy, that steersman who fell asleep at the wheel while business sailed through the seas, the cybernetic seas in this case here. Polynuris was a site devoted to creating a large set of resources that document the ever tighter bind between the academy today and the business world. This is one of the bibliographies on the site, for example. Academe imitates the corporation. General resources in entrepreneurship in the academy in lifelong learning, academy and equality movement, the JIT or just-in-time movement as it applies to the academy. Second thesis, the professions are increasingly bound to the protocols of knowledge work, specifically by information technology. As Alex Galloway points out, protocol, the word, derives from the Greek proto for first and kolema for glue. That is, it's the first leaf of a volume, a flyleaf glued to the case and containing an account of the manuscript. From its first usage on, that is, protocol was an information device, a technology not just of data but of metadata that anticipated what Shoshana Zuboff in her book In the Age of the Smart Machine calls informating, the accretion through computerization of ever thicker and more multiple layers of information, as she puts it, about information. I would call special attention to the notion of glue in protocol, which emblematizes the essential stickiness of information technology, otherwise celebrated for its liquid, even ethereal virtuality. Precisely its liquidity, we recognize, makes IT the perfect superglue with which to coat any profession to make it adhere to the common knowledge work model. Consider, for example, the fusion of the concepts of information and knowledge in the first sentences of Stewart's book. Information and knowledge are the thermonuclear competitive weapons of our time. Knowledge, when you're writing one of these business books, it's important not to be understated at the beginning. Information and knowledge are the thermonuclear competitive weapons of our time. Knowledge is more valuable and more powerful than natural resources, big factories, or fat bankrolls. In industry after industry, success comes to the companies that have the best information or wield it most effectively. Now you'll see in this passage that information and the ability to wield it, which in context here means information technology, stick to the concept of knowledge so closely that there's effectively no space of separation at all. No more so in Stewart's figure than deuterium and tritium after hydrogen fusion. TCP/IP, FTP, SMTP, HTTP, and so on, these and other IT protocols are now our ultimate glue, or to stay with Stewart's metaphor, fusion elements, networking everything together in the runaway fusion explosion called the web. Probably have some fission explosions in there as well. In our context here, that is my context, this means that the protocols of knowledge work embedded in IT are one of the main vectors by which corporate assumptions now enter the academy. Co-partnership, co-research, contractor, donor, and other official relations established between major information technology firms and institutions of learning from K-12 through higher and for-profit education are just the macro side of the equation. The micro side consists in the way that the ordinary work of the humanities now depends on proprietary IT platforms and applications, basically everything you're seeing on my screen, for example. Just try, as I've done in a letter to the editor to get PC Magazine, to review products from an education industry rather than corporate perspective, even on a once-a-year, single-story basis. Quote, "It's not our focus," close quote, was the succinct conclusion of the editor, Michael J. Miller, in an otherwise kind and enlightened response. The fact that the majority of humanities scholars now use an application suite named Office to write files, so-called, as opposed to essays, chapters, or books, indicates a sway, subtle yet tidal, that business protocols do exert. Third thesis. But IT is not just functional in knowledge work. It is also allegorical, or to continue with Michael's word, mythological. We can take a page here from Martha Feldman and James Marsh's study titled Information in Organizations as Signal and Symbol. Feldman and Marsh argue that rational choice theory alone cannot account for the enormous appetite of business for gathering and communicating excessive information that has, quote, little decision relevance, is too late for the decision at hand, or is never considered at all. Such information dependency, Feldman and Marsh suggest, can best be understood through an information behavior approach that views information technology as in great part a symbolic or ritualistic performance of rational decision-making. IT, in other words, is not just functional in the economy of knowledge work, it is also representational. A fact never more clear than during the so-called productivity paradox of the late 1980s and early 1990s, when massive business investment in IT appeared to lead to no or even declining productivity. So this is a chart of investment in information technology in business from the early 80s to the early 90s. And this, meanwhile, is a graph of productivity per worker here. As you might imagine, this raises some issues, or raised some issues in those years of what the information technology was for. It's not until right about here in the graph, 1994, 1995, that the productivity graphs begin to shoot up and go through the ceiling, a climb that is still continuing today in our very strange kind of economic recovery. As I've argued in more detail elsewhere, business kept the faith in IT during these years of the productivity paradox, in part because a true function of IT was to serve as a speculative and not just functional mirror, allowing the corporations to envision whole new ways of distributed, decentralized, networked, non-hierarchical, teamworked, and otherwise restructured work. It was a kind of a playroom, in other words, a kind of a rehearsal space in which to imagine new forms of organization and work processes. Speculative vision, after all, has been a trope of business IT from the beginning. As Zuboff documents in her interviews, early corporate adopters of computers consistently described IT in a phenomenology of transcendental vision. IT was what let them see it all. The recent IBM ad campaign for its middleware and information services continues in this tradition, and here you can see two of these ads, which occur in clustered versions, several at a time, on consecutive rectal pages of a magazine such as Business Week. Here, workers stand like prophets, with physical eyes shut, but mental eyes, we presume, wide open, just imagining the promised land of networked connectivity. Can you see it, reads the slogan. And you may not be able to see the subtext. It's really quite interesting here. Can you see it, reads the ad on the left on the screen. See software integrated, see business automated, see ROI escalated, return on investment. If you can see ROI, then you have to be, I think, Plato or Kant and inhabit some kind of a noumenal sphere here. The one on the right reads, see information organized, see access personalized, see service recognized. And in the logic of this particular sequence of ads, this is the human interface put on top of the business machine perspective of things. So the three subtexts correspond. See software integrated is over here, see information organized. See business automated is see access personalized. and C ROI, escalated, becomes C service, recognize. There's a strange loop between the recognition of service and the establishment on the bottom line of ROI, which is part of the logic loop of contemporary business, how to realize on the bottom line increases in service and quality levels. At once operational and imaginary, in other words, IT is what might be called a functional allegory, or equivalently, an allegory of functionalism. And I think ads like this do a very good job of illustrating that functionalism of allegory, or put in reverse, the allegorism of functionalism in information technology. IT, put it another way, is our preeminent, or one of our preeminent contemporary poieses, and art of fictive making. Coming now to the possible difference of humanities information technology, I want to close this set of theses with two that are not so much descriptive as prescriptive. So the fourth thesis is this one. The humanities should therefore embrace the poiesis of IT for alternative ends, first of all, at the level of organizational imagination. If IT is a poiesis, after all, we would do well to remember that humanities scholars specialize professionally in the history, forms, tropes, and just as importantly, contradictions of poiesis, whether literary or in the expanded Percy Shelleyan sense, social. The humanities then should not just adopt IT, but use it in synchrony with its own traditions to imagine a society of knowledge that overlaps with, but is not necessarily the same as that of current post-industrial capitalism. The place to start, I think, is close to home, in the alternative society that is the academy itself, where the humanities must first take care of business before it can persuasively make a case about business elsewhere. There are two main levels in which the humanities, I think, can use IT to reimagine the protocols of its own work of education. One is organizational. My Dean of Humanities and Fine Arts here at UCSB, David Marshall, has a fine witticism which I think is quite acute about this. He says that in a first-rate research university like yours and mine here, the faculty are in the 21st century, the curriculum lags behind in the 20th century, and the administrative structures and administrators are in the 19th century. Business uses the functional allegory of IT, we know, to restructure. I think the humanities can too, even if, and especially if, the business it needs to restructure is in crucial ways not the same as corporate business. Here I come to what I perceive to be one of the frontiers of IT in the humanities. That is the far territory in which the many scattered humanities computing programs, centers, projects, and so on that now exist and that have used IT as a catalyst to reorganize the normal disciplinary work of the humanities, evolve from ad hoc organizational experiments into strategic paradigms that might be of interest to the profession as a whole. In general, we must acknowledge the profession of the humanities has been appallingly unimaginative in regard to the organization of its own labor, simply taking it for granted that its restructuring impulse toward interdisciplinarity and collaboration can be managed within the same old divisional, college, departmental, committee, and classroom arrangements, supplemented by ad hoc interdisciplinary arrangements. The common denominator of many of these well-intentioned but institutionally insecure interdisciplinary and collaborative hacks is that they create organizational shells within which the now ingrained individual research and teaching of the humanities continues unchanged, with hardly any of us, for example, actually co-teaching or co-producing research with anyone else in ways that exceed well-established and limited humanities protocols, for example, the colloquium, the conference, or the panel. It might be remarked at this point, by the way, just in the way of improvisation, that there is amazing synchrony between the beginning and end of Michael Heim's talk you may recognize and this section of my talk, but this is completely an accident. Our panel is structured like most academic panels in such a way that it is a mere, as it were, facade of collaboration. There wasn't any underlayer of collaboration that produced this amazing accident of synchrony here. And now that I think of it, thinking about Michael's unicorn, if I may make one extra turn or play upon that trope, it's not, Michael, that there are no unicorns. It's that for the world of interdisciplinarity and collaboration, there are no multicorns, which is what we need. We have plenty of unicorns. The unicorn in my allegory here is standing for that single, alone, solitary scholar working in a library carrel somewhere, sort of drilling down intensely into a text. All of this, to return to my paper, is despite the fact that we live in an era of declining sponsorship for individual humanities research, the unicorns, as it has been channeled through the increasingly obsolete and impoverished organizational form of the fellowship. Relatively few humanities scholars thus try for large-scale project or institution-based rather than individual funding from the government or from industry to build structurally interdisciplinary and collaborative programs. And even fewer seek to initiate the systemic campus division or department-wide reorganization of the humanities that would be needed to fold the interdisciplinary and collaborative work of such projects structurally into normal work. To the point, for example, of establishing course relief for grant raising and project management duties, or tenurable rewards for junior faculty working on collaborative projects. I note here that Kathy N. Davidson and David Theo Goldberg concur on this issue in their important essay published last year in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled A Manifesto for the Humanities in a Technological Age. Could IT in the humanities make a difference? Those in the humanities, and I think that there are many of us like this in this room here, who have started funded collaborative projects know that IT is a potential channel for refunding and reorganizing the humanities. There are ways of using IT to claim a place at the table where campus or external funding agencies assign monies that have worked, and many other ways that the humanities have not yet learned how to work, especially in the direction of cross-disciplinary ventures, for example, with the arts and with engineering and the sciences. One of the main tasks of those establishing programs in humanities technology, I suggest, is to use IT to refund and reorganize humanities work with the ultimate goal not of instituting, as it were, Humanities Inc., but of giving the humanities the freedom and resources to imagine humanities scholarship anew in relation both to academic and business modes. The relation between narrow research communities and broad student audiences, for example, need not be the same as that between business producers and consumers. But unless the existing organizational paradigms for humanities works are supplemented by new models, for example, laboratory or studio-like environments in which faculty mix with students in production work, or new research units intermixing faculty from the humanities, arts, sciences, engineering, and social sciences, it will become increasingly difficult to embed the particular knowledge of the humanities within the general knowledge of knowledge work. It will be difficult, for instance, to make a case before a state legislature, a funding agency, and ultimately the general public for the study of historical knowledges deemed obsolete by business, to analyze data through the massively inefficient methods such as close reading of the humanities, or otherwise to invest resources in the usually half-baked, buggy, never ready for IPO products symptomatic of education. For example, student projects, dissertations, faculty websites such as my own Voice of the Shuttle. That website was attacked by a bad guy about 1.5 years ago through a SQL server, a SQL injection attack. We restored the site from tape the next day, but it took us 3.5 months to recode the ASP code in the background to at least harden the system a little bit from the same kind of attack. Business would never tolerate that. Why did I tolerate that? This particular kind of work was beyond my own technical competence. The graduate student that I was working with was busy. He had a dissertation to write. He had a foreign language exam to pass. You can never treat the people in the academic community, in other words, in exactly the same way that you can treat, say, an employee or a set of managers and so on. There's this important difference between the business and academic worlds which needs to be kept in mind. Fifth thesis, and this is the final one. The other level on which the humanities should embrace the poetic power of information technology for alternative ends is not organizational, but technical. Search, query, sample, select, scan, filter, sharpen, blur, cut, paste, insert, sum, average, tag, encode, markup, upload, download. attach, export, import, configure, install, save, backup, reboot, reinstall, write, read. These are some of the verbs on the top level menu of technical skills that business workers and others participating in the common protocols of knowledge work now need to command. By contrast, here's the usual top-level menu of the operations that are systematically or explicitly addressed in higher education literature classrooms. To take an example from my own native discipline: read, write, close read, contextualize or historicize, interpret, critique. With all other technical skills subordinated to other levels of the educational establishment or taught unsystematically: composition, computers and writing, tech support, and so on. Of course, there are crucial overlaps between the two menus, especially read and write. But there's also a fundamental disparity in the levels, explicitness, numbers, and the granularity of technical skills. Given the contemporary importance of technical protocols, I suggest, the time has come for the humanities to face up to its future as a technical profession like others. Only so can it give its students the necessary skills and, adding its normative values to those of other social sectors, impart the imagination of such skills capable of envisioning a more humane business and ultimately culture of knowledge. In short, if techne is where poiesis now lives, something that both business and the cool users of the newest bleeding edge technologies attest, then I think that is where the humanities must go. Above all, I believe the humanities can only teach a broader sense of culture in the age of corporate culture by demonstrating that the contemporary instinct for technical competence need not be oblivious to the sense of history that is the primary means by which the humanities at once reinforce and critique culture. This is something now I've said in my book, The Laws of Cool, but it's important enough that I want to repeat one page from that book here. Technique cannot be surrendered, I say there, up to the forces of productivity as a matter of purely practical skills and competencies extrinsic to serious humanistic study. Educators have, in fact, been intent since at least the time of, say, the Russian formalists on showing that the humanities can be methodologically technical, raising the anger of those who accept the need for technical jargon in every single other field of contemporary knowledge except the humanities. But what this effort must be for, ultimately, is to equip humanities educators to reverse the field by insisting on the humanity of technique. The best way to do so is to bring to technique an awareness, I think, of historical techniques. Here are the kinds of questions to be posed, I hope, in the humanities of the future, considered as a technical profession. How might knowledge workers be educated both in contemporary information technique, the collection, verification, and collation of data, comparative and numerical analysis, synthesis and summarization, attribution of sources, use of media to produce, manipulate, and circulate results, and in archaic and historical knowledge technique, for example, memorization, storytelling, music, dance, weaving and other handicraft, iconography, rhetoric, close reading, with the ultimate goal of fostering a richer, more diverse, less self-centered sense of modern technical identity. What and how did people know, for instance, when cultures were dominated technically by orality, by manuscripts, or by print? How, in other words, is the progress of knowledge constituted from broad, diverse, and always internally rifted negotiations with historical knowledges, such that every bleeding-edge innovation creates in its shadow not just a dark hemisphere of obsolete peoples, residual, subcultural, throwaway, consigned to the social margin, but also repurposing and recirculation of the knowledges of the people of the margin, who after all are the true bleeding edge. That's the end of the extract from my book that I want to read, and it's important because, if you like, that's the action program or executable that is contained within the book. In an effort to implement that executable recently, a group of us here at UCSB in the UC system, and hopefully with affiliations with others around the nation in the year to come, have just started a project. We're calling it Transliteracies. In technological, social, and cultural practices of online reading. And I'll just give you a thumbnail sketch of the gist of the idea here. This is the initial planning conference, which is happening about a month from now. We've got a group of humanities scholars coming. We've got a group of social scientists coming. And we have computer scientists and technologists coming as well, to pick out just some of the latter. Curtis Wong, who's head of the new media research group at Microsoft. John Seeley Brown, formerly director of the Xerox PARC establishment. Let's see, some of the other computer science. Kevin Almroth, who specializes in multicasting. Matthew Turk, who works in human-computer interfaces, and so on here. Walter Bender, head of the MIT Media Lab. The basic idea behind this project is we're getting together a group of humanities scholars, social scientists, and computer scientists to work together on a feature of information technology which is close to the core identity of humanities, and that's textual experience. Here in Southern California, we're often referred to now as the joystick corridor. We are the great corridor of the gaming industry and so on. But I'd like to remind my colleagues that for the humanities and for the information sphere at large, textual experience still does matter in a very important way. What better way might there be for the humanities to engage collaboratively and in a truly interdisciplinary fashion with its colleagues in the social sciences and in the engineering sciences than to work together on developing technical initiatives and technical tools that would improve the experience of online reading today? Not just creating tools, but also providing a matrix of assumptions that would allow us to know what the improvement of such reading might mean based on a historical baseline of comparisons and standards and so on. So that's what we're trying to do in this project. We're trying to build some tools that improve the experience of online reading as a social and individual experience, but in a way that wraps around it a larger social and human consideration of what improvement might mean. To conclude, my suggestion is that while the humanities must begin to teach the technical skills needed to flourish in today's society, such competence is most valuable both to individuals and society when wed to a full sense of the technical relationship between contemporary knowledge work and the history of human life. The humanities, a technical profession. Can you see it? I'll stop there.
In terms of the avatar event, I was just wondering, when you were showing us the representations, the screen captures, from whose perspective? I mean, is that, were those, would that be the perspective if you were participating as an avatar, you were looking out, or is that kind of a, a God's eye view?
Excellent question. There is no God's eye view in the avatar world. So they're all perspectival, and all of those shots were taken from one monitor or another. And as a result, and that view is constantly changing. And so you get a multi-shifting perspective.
Okay, so what you showed us, it was what we might have seen were we an avatar.
And had you been at that particular spot at that particular time.
Okay, and within those setups, can you shift between, I mean, could you, switch your perspective to look at through somebody else's avatar?
Let's see. On some instances you could, but most of the time most of the worlds that we created, you would be fixed to the viewpoint of one user. Although, as you multiply the monitors, just as here, Alan is really double Alan. And so, although we only have one perspective of him here, but someone else is taking, oh no, maybe not. I don't know if you have what kind of camera you have in the back, but so it does get multi-perspectival right off, yeah.
Okay, but I mean, so you would have the ability to switch between multiple perspectives?
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, this is one of the painful things, is to disabuse yourself of the God's eye view, that the lecturer doesn't have a superior position in space unless everybody agrees on that.
Okay.
In the situation.
Okay, and then just if can I do a second question? It's sort of similar. Maybe this is the flip side of that question. I mean, you presented sort of virtual worlds with, where you talked about you had different themed events, and clearly the avatars you showed, a lot of them were based around similar themes. You had kind of I think what this morning was referred to as the Pillsbury Doughboy, sort of the blob bodies. Then you had some birds. But I was just wondering, I mean, did the issue of the regulation of avatar experience ever come up? If someone, for example, wanted to create an avatar that was pornographic or racially or politically offensive, I mean, did that issue ever come up? If so, how did you deal with it? Or if it didn't, isn't this a serious concern?
Yeah, as we approached the project from the viewpoint of distribution through a mentoring system where college kids would mentor young kids about how to do. I mean, the idea there was that the heart of helpfulness would be the beginning of the project, because we're asking people to make an effort in another part of the world that we may be in conflict with, and we're asking the young people over there to help kids over there do what we're doing. So we have to start with that idea. That's why we had built into the model of what we were doing a mentoring situation, because we wanted helpfulness to be the basic premise of the whole thing. A generosity, as opposed to defensiveness, which is what our country has tended to become. And at any rate, the idea of moderating all the meetings was built into it as well. That it's necessary, if you don't have a God's eye, in some sense you have to have an organized perspective, in the sense that someone has to decide if some activities are distracting, pornographic, or we've had playful times when these birds were doing mating processes that were distracting from the main lecture. And so you need to have a moderator who can speak to those individuals and say, stop doing that with those birds. And, and you have to be able to, the moderator has to have the ability to throw people out of the world if necessary. So one of our premises that we developed this over time was that the meetings, the avatar diplomacy meetings, would be all moderated. That is, there would be someone on hand, a skilled individual, someone who has proven their skills at controlling some organizational ability to make a meeting happen. So someone like Mark, who's doing this in the physical world, you need to have someone for an international meeting. One of the issues that came up that may touch on this question too is, what form of self-presentation would, let's say, people in Iraq have? Would they want to project? Would their children want to project some kind of national identity as a vis-a-vis the United States? What kind of would there be some national quality to their avatars as they introduce themselves to each other and say, we're going to have pen pals meeting now from two different parts of the world, and we're going to play. I mean, our vision was that the college teams would be responsible for that development, for that self-presentation, and we didn't know what was going to happen in terms of national identity. Maybe everybody would be wearing Jordache jeans. I don't know, but we wanted that to unfold. The tools are fairly primitive for avatar design, and we were thinking of making them more like Potato Head, Mr. Potato Head, something along a very simple line to start with. So people would have a kit, and certain decisions would be made already. But there would be enough, we would hope, enough space for play to express who they are vis-a-vis the other kids. And maybe that's a very dangerous thing to do. Maybe people thought it was too dangerous. But that was a thought. And the idea is to meet the other as an other, and to respect and acknowledge that other, just like kids would play. Kids would just play with each other and acknowledge that they're different from each other.
Michael, Alan has a question.
On a comment here, can you see my hand going up the usual cue? But I'm not sure that works this way. I just wanted to add that on the, not so much on the global scale that Michael was talking about, but on a sort of a very microcosmic scale, there's a wonderful illustration of some of what Michael was talking about. Michael was actually in residence here at UC Santa Barbara. What was that, about 2 or 3 years ago? at our Digital Cultures project for about 3 weeks or so, and gave a wonderful set of workshops and so on for our students in world building in our transcription studio here. And just watching him at work illustrates one of the things that I was talking about in my point, which is that the God's eye view of, the disciplinary God's eye view of the teacher or the authority figure becomes distributed and experimental in interesting kinds of ways. Michael was, to use the words in his last answer, both mentor and moderator, more than he was a sort of teacher in this wonderful kind of workshop environment. One of the things I took away from that session, and that I want to link to in Michael's comment, is that as we move forward into this world of sort of tool building and world building, we're going to have to relearn what it actually means to teach in our academies. That teaching is actually an activity that involves new kinds of activities, call them mentorship or negotiation or diplomacy or other kinds of things in which we're, half the time lecturing from on high, and the other half of the time crawling under the tables trying to jack in Ethernet cables and so on. We're sort of redistributing our authority.
Alan, I just want to commend you on the transliteracies project. I think it's a very important aspect to start thinking about reading online. And even though today we know that most people push the print button before they start reading, but I think there will be a movement to reading online. And I just wanted to, because there weren't other questions coming up, just to speak a bit about the work that we've been doing in Canada on this. We've got I work with a public knowledge project, and we're building with a concept of a reading environment. And that is, what kind of tools can we put into place that will create a different kind of reading environment? And in particular, a reading environment that will let people work with materials they wouldn't have worked with before. And that is access to information sources like health information, research that's available online, and those kinds of tools, those kinds of resources using different kinds of tools. And the pedagogical approach we're trying to work with is a kind of anti-didactic stance. That is, we provide the tools rather than teach them how to read. We set up an environment that encourages them to explore the tools as opposed to giving them kind of structured lessons. And the real danger, at least the work we've done so far, puts us in a position that challenges the notion of the text. And that is that the tools have a tendency, when they're not working well, to distract and to overwhelm and to lead people from one text to another text to another text to another text. And that the reading experience isn't the kind of textual experience and fidelity to the author's intent and all of those things that we're used to. And at this point, we're still kind of wrestling with our discomfort around that, but have been impressed by the way that people are having, in some sense, a coherent reading experience that to us is distracted, fragmented, and meandering. Right, yeah. I have two responses to that. One is, by way of an anecdote, I was at Duke University last year giving a paper. Simultaneously, they were running an event in their new media center there. It was a fully interactive, sensor-activated room. The sensors, by infrared and other pickup means, sense the motions of bodies within the rooms. Went through a complicated algorithm that amassed the motions of bodies together in a stochastic kind of way, and depending on the result, projected images all around the room together with sounds. Generally, if there were a lot of people moving around very fast, the multimedia display was more interesting than not. For this particular event, they commissioned a resident poet in the Duke area to write a poem and have it projected on the walls. And I happened to be there on the inaugural day of this exhibition, and started talking to the poet, whose name I'm sorry that I can't remember right now. He was standing there kind of bemused, saying, actually I thought I was writing my poem to be read, but this room rewards people for jumping up and down and running around. There was a kind of a strange, desynchronization between what we had understood to be the reading experience and these new technologies. You're right, it's going to take a lot of intelligent design to get that to work together. My second comment, though, goes a little bit deeper into the logic behind this transliteracies project that we're trying to start here. Part of my hypothesis, yet to be proven, is that there's a lot of hidden intelligence, strategy, and tactics within
what I used to call low attention modes or low cognitive modes of reading. I don't use that term anymore because it raises too much ire from people. But what I mean by low cognitive or low attention span reading is distracted reading, quick reading, browsing, searching, index-based reading, all that kind of work which takes up an inordinate amount of our textual experience space and time online as compared to turning the pages of a book. So some of the project participants I'm working with are interested in sort of mining the hidden intelligence of distracted reading. Are there ways to do that well as opposed to not well? What does distraction in reading tell us that concentrated individual reading cannot? And the secondary hypothesis that we're working with is that part of what distracted reading is about, distraction is a negative description of that. The positive description of that is that it's a way of networking us together with other readers and other influences in a fully multi-subject kind of environment. So we're interested in sort of networked environments of reading as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Ellen? Yeah, it's
Yes.
It's Geert.
Hi,
Hello.
Geert.
Hi. Yeah, would you, in general, make the distinction that you find in the literature between technology as a tool and as an environment? I can very easily imagine that your radical program can easily be adopted and changed, pacified by saying, well, we like part of what you're suggesting. Why don't we just use the technology as a tool and just continue basically with the humanities as they are? I see this response quite often around me. I don't think it's going anywhere much, but you certainly must have a response to this.
I do have a response. I've thought a long time about this and thought in practical ways too. Practical in the sense of arguments with administrators about where the funding goes, what kinds of installations to build, where those installations exist in the academy, and so on here. My general philosophy about technological tools in the humanities is that used well, they obviate or make moot the very concept of tool. They probably make moot the concept of environment as well. They become not instruments that are third-party instruments that we use to do something else. They become a kind of lens through which we look. They become part of what we do here. They become part of our thinking equipment, our mental equipment, as Kenneth Burke used to call it here. So I think that what early adopters and what those people who in humanities are specifically concentrated on working with technology should do is to design or help design tools well so that they carry within them a kind of a native intelligence, critical awareness, and a sort of social awareness that even if they are distributed from that point on to users who are completely oblivious to the design that went behind them, still maintain some of that larger consciousness. I think that's the ultimate goal of good design work here. Beyond that, I would say that at some point, as a designer of a technological tool, if we can get the humanists and the social scientists and the computer engineers to work together, at some point the humanities are going to have to be humble enough to realize that just like engineers, at some point they're going to have to surrender the use of their tools to the clients who will find interesting ways to use it by our design or not. I'm the son of a structural engineer who built buildings for a livelihood. It's taken me a long time. It's taken me 52 years to come around from my initial rebellion against engineering. That's why I became an English major, right? To accept the fact that I can imagine no finer epitaph than son of an engineer. I think that the engineer's stance, appropriately and broadly and expansively considered, is probably the right one for the humanities now. I'm serious when I say that I think the humanities should be a technical profession. The imaginative work, the intelligence work should go into the design of things including not just writings and articles and classrooms, but also tools and so on. And then at some point, to be a full-fledged member of our society, you have to take that sort of engineer's perspective and say, here, I let it go. This is for you now.
I would like to continue with that and just hear briefly your response to recent tools or things that will really have an impact on the humanities. The first is the introduction of free software and open source, not just as software, but as a principle, as a metaphor, and as a guidance. And the second one would be the rise of Wikipedia and other, really collaborative environments, which really transform knowledge production, and I think can be utilized in an enormous, productive way in the humanities.
In fact, those two questions overlap to some degree because wiki environments, many of them, at least the ones that we would adopt in the academy, are open source, free software kinds of environments running in a kind of Linux, PHP, Apache kind of environment here. This site that you're seeing on the screen right now, the Transliteracy site, was built in WordPress version 1.5. As some of you may know, that's an open source content management system. Really, it's a blog engine driving this in the background here. I'm very interested in open source, not just for its technologies, but for its philosophy and for its kind of a social imagination here. There was a line in my paper at one point where I was somewhat pessimistic about the extent to which academics were bound hand and foot to proprietary information technology platforms, tools, and so on. There's a footnote in the paper that I wasn't able to get in, which is about the increasing use of open source tools at the back end, at the server level, at the platform level. It's not yet reached, and I'm not sure that in the conceivable future it will reach the client end, that is what's happening on an academic's actual desktop or laptop machine here. But those are wonderful tools and sort of thinking instruments. One of the things I'll be doing next year is teaching an undergraduate workshop. It's designed as a research workshop on the theme of collaboration. So thematically, the workshop will be moving back into history to look at famous examples of literary collaboration, all the way from, say, Boswell and Dr. Johnson through Eliot and Pound and so on, up to contemporary times. The class itself, however, will be run entirely in a wiki environment here that allows the students to post and open edit each other's and my comments as well. The intent there is to use the technology, the design within that technology, to serve as a thinking instrument about collaboration itself. So I think I'm on the same page with you that there's tremendous potential in these new open source tools for collaboration and interdisciplinarity.
I have two questions. One, to continue what Geert was saying. There's two phenomena, the digitizing of literature and Google projects. I also thought that might change a lot in humanities so that we could move closer to computational linguistics, so corpus-based analysis. A lot of things which were in your menu for humanities, such as close reading and interpretation, I think with the advent of the basically digital literature at such a stage, I think we'll need to prepare ourselves for that and probably to have some kind of a rebirth of all of this on the large digital scale. I think this is just an important, I wanted to know what you think about this. And another question I have, kind of more general. So what's your definition of humanities? You basically, it seems like your assumption is that, well, that humanities is defined by the tool or by the method. And for humanities to become a technical profession, we need to switch to the method. But isn't it the problem that the subject matter is what is not as valuable for the society these days? And let's say for somebody in humanities who is studying Shakespeare, what does it mean to become a technical professional? So, okay, you can study Shakespeare with this or that tool, but how does it connect you to a business, corporation, or anything?
Okay, let me take the second question first, and then go back to the first question. I don't know whether any of you have seen David Byrne's presentation on PowerPoint called I Love PowerPoint. You know, David Byrne was the lead singer for the rock group The Talking Heads. And lately he's fallen in love with PowerPoint. He is going around the country, primarily the campuses, giving hour-and-a-half lectures titled I Love PowerPoint. It's really quite funny, actually. He walks into the conference hall, and immediately the audience is up on his feet, whistling and clapping, and you know, I wonder why we don't get these kinds of receptions. First thing he puts on the screen is this cheesy, you know, welcome in PowerPoint, and the audience breaks up. And the next slide is, you know, introduction to PowerPoint, and at that point the audience is sort of rolling in the aisles here. Byrne's main point about PowerPoint, which he uses as an artistic presentation medium, is that PowerPoint is a performance environment. It's an obvious point, of course, but it's got the kind of obviousness which has deep profundity to it. In his lecture, he makes a comparison between PowerPoint and certain kinds of theaters of the absurd, and also Far Eastern no theater and so on, in which, as you are watching the puppets or the actors, you are also seeing the apparatus on stage. There's no attempt to sort of hide the apparatus, the equipment, the sort of puppet strings happening in the background. And his thesis is that this is a very sophisticated presentation and performance medium, not unlike drama. So the specific answer to the question, you know, how might the subject matter of the humanities fit in, especially in the case of Shakespeare here, that's quite interesting to think about it in this context. What better forum, what better set of resources would there be for learning how to intelligently design a performance space, whether it be a kind of an avatar world like the one that Michael has been you know, building, or whether it be a corporate conference room, that to go back to the rich menu of historical human cultural resources in such techniques, let's call them, as performance, speaking, writing, dancing, singing, all those human activities that are once functional and expressive at the same time. So that would be my approach toward answering that question. That's at least, I think, the case that the humanities must make. Otherwise, we have no stake in the future. The only stake that we could imagine is to serve as you know, midwives toward more important kinds of knowledges, in which the expressive and other functions are divorced from the functional functions of technology. In answer to the first question about computational linguistics and so on, this is a very interesting time loop in the history of humanities computing that we are witnessing now. As you no doubt know, and many others, you know, about 20 or 30 years ago, when people in the humanities became interested in computing, first of all, one of the fields that was vibrant and continues to be vibrant today back then was you know, computational linguistics, that particular approach to computing and large bases of print text that had been digitized. Just after that, the people who interested in hypertext and hypertext theory came onto the scene, and they sort of stole the thunder for a while. Lately, hypertext and hypertext theory seem a little bit quaint and obsolete, and in a strange kind of time loop, I think that what is coming back to the forefront is computational linguistics and associated approaches. So one of the things that we want to do in this transliteracies project, for example, is to imagine building tools that would be able to analyze text based on metadata, pattern recognition, and other, let's call them stochastic methods, that would allow us to, here's one scenario, for example, allow us to present a body of text to an audience who would make up one community, but who would be able to perceive the text differently based on their difference in national or language background, based on their difference in ages, and so on. So imagine, for example, being able to create a plugin for Google which would allow you to press a button at the top saying, just show me the hits that are appropriate or that might be of interest to a fifth grader, or to a scholar, or to somebody else. those kinds of tools, I think, will require tools and technologies that depend on such things as computational linguistics.
Final question?
So first I wanted to thank you both for some very rich and provocative papers. As I was listening, I was fascinated by the ways in which you were talking about both levels of cyber-disciplinarity, right? So both the notion of disciplinarity.
Is that Wendy? Yeah.
Sorry? Can you hear me,
Is that
Alan?
Wendy? Yeah.
Yeah, it is Wendy.
I can't really see, so hi, Wendy.
Hi, Alan. Yeah, I cut my
Okay.
hair. I look really different. Nobody
All
recognizes
right.
me.
Go ahead.
I think I look older now. Okay. So you were talking about both levels of discipline, right? Both in terms of a field of study, but also the notion of discipline as in being trained, right? How we're trained and how we're trained perhaps in ways that we're not aware of, information technology and whatnot. And as I was listening, I was wondering if discipline is actually the word we want to hold on to, or if discipline is precisely where we need to put some pressure on. Because if the notion of discipline is anything, it is 19th century. And just hearing about the ways you were talking about authorities and training and thinking through the ways we work through information technology, I was wondering if both of you could talk a little more explicitly about the notion of discipline.
Want to go first, Michael, or?
Okay, sure. Okay. Well, I guess I see discipline as so important in terms of skillfulness, and I can see that the continuity of the apprenticeship, let's say, to skillfulness is highly desirable. However, I guess what is I find most inimical to my own impulses is the lack of purpose or meaning that a discipline can develop over time when it's disconnected to the impulses of its cultural currents. In other words, the intensity that gives discipline itself meaning, the purposiveness, direction, that seems to me very much lacking. And so I see a lack of joy, for example, on the campuses, which is striking to me. And I'm told, well, these students have huge debts they're going to be carrying for years. They know that. They're living within those debts and so on. And I hear a very sad story. It seems to me that somehow joy requires a breakthrough beyond disciplines to purpose, in which your skills become wonderfully useful because you can see what you can accomplish with them. And so they don't seem to be the harshness of discipline, maybe in the Latin disciplina, but rather they're ways in which you now can really use these tools in an exciting way, and you can see something happening, and your heart can open and can meet other hearts through this process. So I guess to me, discipline is, I guess if we ever do want to use the word tool, although like Alan, I share this this reluctance to use the word in conjunction with digital technology or technology as such, because it's not really appropriate. It doesn't really explain or address what is talked about when we talk about a tool. But I think discipline is somehow subordinate to something I maybe would more broadly call heart impulse or desire or a project. So anyway, that's my reaction. Alan?
Actually, yeah, connects up with one of the comments I made earlier about the redistribution, let us call it the restructuring of authority, for example, in the classroom or in the educational establishment here. I don't actually want to get away from the notion of discipline. Somewhat unfairly, I made Michael go first so that I could open up my online dictionary here and look up the etymology of that word. And discipulus, pupil, comes from the older root discere for learning, for a certain kind of intellectual discernment. What that would seem to emblematize is that we don't get learning without discipline at some level. So then the operative critical question becomes what kind of discipline we had what kind of discipline the new information technologies allow us to have now, and who exerts that discipline upon whom. When I think about it, one of the best things that I imagine the new information technologies allowing us to do is to rethink the status of discipline in society based on models of discipline in the academy which would not otherwise no longer have any fair play in a larger venue. People have written about this, but it continues to be the case, not just in the humanities in the academy, but certainly in the social sciences, and even more certainly, say, in lab environments in the sciences, that perhaps the most effective and powerful mode of learning in the academy occurs through acts of discipleship, that is, relations of mentor and disciple. We use that phrase precisely because we do not have an adequate way to formalize the exact manner in which knowledge leaps sort of osmotically from mentor to disciple and back again in some closed, intimate feedback loop. Now, from the 19th century on, and certainly into the industrial era, that model of learning, of discipleship, began to look creaky and very obsolete, as if we all in the humanities still hung out in the neck of the woods where craft and apprenticeship still happened, as opposed to the rest of the universe. I think what information technology can allow us to do now is to find interesting and productive and constructive ways to allow discipleship to happen anew and with a new provenance and new application. Just a very simple instance. I don't actually like this technology myself very much, the entire species of instant messaging and chat and so on. But the fact that one of my undergraduates can, while I'm busy working on a paper at about 12 midnight and so or so, ring me up and say, "Professor, I've got a problem about this particular paper." That's a substantive change in the nature of the teacher-student relationship. That moves me closer to an informal, I would call it a discipleship relationship with that student. Matters of authority still exist in that disciplinary relationship, but they need not be the same channels of authority configured in the same kind of way. So that's how I would answer that question.
Well, I think we should conclude the session. Could we thank both of our participants and also a little nod for the technicians at both ends?